Michael sat at his desk, a polished oak masterpiece that had seen its fair share of long, stressful days. Today was no different. The morning had been filled with anxiety, much like many others before it. Business reports piled up in front of him, none of them offering any comfort. As he buried himself deeper into the numbers, the door creaked open, and Lily stepped into the room. "Hey, would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice soft but concerned. "You haven't even had breakfast today." "Sorry, not in the mood," Michael replied without looking up from the documents. "I'm probably going to have to call in the manager today. If I don't, I'm going to lose my mind. Everything is falling apart, profits are dropping, product costs are skyrocketing. We haven't been making any real money from most of the cafes and restaurants. Just losses, and whatever's left goes straight to the trash. Do you need me to help with anything?" Lily offered, her brow furrowed. "Not right now, love, but thanks for asking," Michael said, finally glancing at her with a tired smile. Lily lingered for a moment before quietly leaving the room, but just as she closed the door, Michael called her back. "Actually, you know what? Let's have that tea after all. I'm not getting anything done right now without talking to the manager first. I might as well take a break while I wait." Lily's face brightened with a smile as she gently closed the door behind her, knowing that her husband would soon join her in the living room. Michael sighed deeply and closed the finance book, running a hand through his hair. It was time to stop trying to handle everything alone. His manager could take on more responsibility, and maybe, just maybe, he could spend some time with Lily, who had been growing weary of his constant absence lately. He understood this, and it weighed heavily on him as well. He slowly made his way downstairs, where tea and biscuits were already set out on the table. Lily sat by the fireplace, the flames crackling softly as she flipped through a magazine. When she heard his footsteps, she looked up and smiled warmly, setting the magazine aside. "What's with the fireplace?" Michael chuckled, sitting down next to her in the adjacent armchair. "It's the middle of summer. It's got to be at least 28 degrees outside. I wanted to have a cozy morning with my husband, even in the summer," Lily replied with a playful grin. "You're always traveling for work, so we rarely get to enjoy mornings like this together." "Well, this is nice. Thanks for the tea, love," Michael said, taking a sip. He hesitated for a moment before bringing up the topic that had been weighing on his mind all day. "About the restaurants, it's not looking good. We might have to close a few." Lily's smile faded slightly, but she remained calm. "Is it really that bad?" "It's not a complete disaster," Michael said, running a hand through his hair, "but a lot of them are bleeding money. They're just not profitable, and we're sinking too much into keeping them afloat. I'm going to call George, he's the manager, and we'll figure it out. I think we'll have to close the ones that aren't performing. It won't hurt our overall finances too much, but it's frustrating." "I know how much you care about the business," Lily said, reaching out to hold his hand. "You've poured your heart into it. It's hard to let go, even when you know it's the right decision." Michael squeezed her hand, grateful for her understanding. "Yeah, I love this business. But you're right. Some things just need to change. I'll call George, and we'll sort it out." Lily smiled. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe we should take a winter vacation. Like we used to. What do you think? Thailand, maybe? A warm New Year without snow." Michael laughed. "New Year without snow? Why not? We haven't done that in years." "That sounds perfect." "Then it's settled," Lily said, her eyes twinkling. "After you handle the restaurant situation, we'll book the tickets." After their tea, Michael returned to his office and dialed George's number. "Can you come by today?" Michael asked, not bothering with formalities. They had already discussed the dire state of things over text, so George didn't need much explanation. "I'll be at your place by 6, George replied, his voice cool and professional. "We can head out to the locations tomorrow." "All right, see you then," Michael said, his tone steady but tired as he hung up the phone. From the window of the library, Lily spotted a white car pulling up to the house. She rushed down the stairs, almost tripping in her haste. "Michael, George is here already," she exclaimed, breathless as she nearly collided with her husband at the bottom of the stairs. "He said 6, but it's only 5, Michael chuckled, catching her just in time. "Guess he's eager to get this over with. But the table's not set, and it's so disrespectful to have him waiting without proper hospitality." Lily fretted, already calling out to the house staff, "Anna, Sarah. Quickly, set the table. Hurry." The staff rushed about, setting up dinner as fast as they could, while Michael stood back, watching the scene with amusement. "It's just George, honey," he said, laughing. "He's not royalty, just the manager. You don't need to go all out for him." George entered the house without knocking, as he had done countless times before. But unlike previous visits, this time Lily was home, and she greeted him at the door. "You're early," Lily said, eyeing him warily. Weren't you supposed to meet my husband at 6? George removed his hat and nodded apologetically. Yes, I was. I apologize for the early arrival. Just then, Michael appeared in the doorway, far more casually dressed than his wife, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Lily glanced at him with a mix of disapproval and concern. Darling, look at how you're dressed, she exclaimed, scrutinizing him from head to toe. George, please, come in, she added with a polite but firm tone. Dinner will be served soon. Michael chuckled and hugged Lily from behind. Relax, darling. George is just here to discuss business with me. But you said he was staying the night. Lily whispered through gritted teeth, smiling at George to keep up appearances. George overheard and chuckled quietly. I won't say no to dinner if it's offered. We'll discuss business first, then eat, Michael said with a wink at his wife. Lily flashed a tight smile at her husband, but Michael could sense the frustration in her eyes. Oh, women, he sighed to himself as he led George into his office to talk. Things are bad, as you already know, Michael began once they were seated. I do, George replied, his face impassive. I prepared those reports myself. Tomorrow, we'll go to some of the locations, Michael continued. Some of them have both a cafe and a restaurant in the same spot. We need to figure out what's worth saving before we make any decisions. I'm thinking we close the restaurants that aren't doing well, especially those in the outskirts of town. They're not necessary, and the expenses are too high. Maybe we should keep the smaller cafes. They're still making a profit. George nodded. I agree. Tomorrow, I'd suggest starting with the location on Westbrook Avenue. It's not too far, and I'm almost certain we'll need to shut down the restaurant there. With a sigh, Michael leaned back in his chair. All right, we'll start there. Let's wrap this up. The next morning, Michael and George headed to the Westbrook location, a large commercial center where, somehow, Michael had managed to open both a cafe and a restaurant right across from each other. The cafe, a casual spot named Romantino, was bringing in decent profits. The restaurant, however, had been a disaster, hardly any customers, despite its high-end design. Michael parked his car and rushed to catch up with George, who was already striding ahead as though he couldn't wait to shut the place down, as if it were his own personal failure. They decided to check on the cafe first. It was still early, and there weren't many customers yet, but a few were scattered around, enjoying breakfast. Hey, why is it so quiet in here? Michael asked the cafe manager, Jessica, as he scanned the nearly empty tables. Jessica smiled, unbothered. Mornings are usually slow, Mr. Michaels. Most of the crowd comes in over the weekend. Michael and George were shown to the best table by the window, where Jessica joined them to discuss the state of the cafe. George pulled out the necessary documents, and they got right down to business. Well, the cafe's doing well enough that we won't need to shut it down, George said after flipping through the figures. Jessica breathed an audible sigh of relief, her shoulders visibly relaxing. But, George added, there's an issue with the payroll. You're paying some of the staff far more than we should be. Too many bonuses, and it's cutting into the profit. Jessica's face fell. But, we've got an incredible team. From the waitstaff to the chefs, everyone's doing such a great job. They deserve those bonuses. Not every month, Michael chimed in. A bonus is a reward, not a regular paycheck. I gave you the authority to manage salaries and incentives, but it has to be within reason. You can't put the business at risk. Jessica nodded, chastened. I'll speak to the staff about it. George continued, do you know how many people are coming into the restaurant across the way? What's the revenue like there? Jessica hesitated. We've had several meetings about it. Hardly anyone goes there, even after we slashed the prices. The problem isn't the food, it's the concept. The restaurant just isn't popular. Is it a bad chef? Michael asked, leaning forward. Jessica shook her head. No, not at all. The regulars never complain about the quality. It's just that the place isn't appealing to people. Too expensive, too formal, and there's a popular restaurant right next door that's already established in the market. So why haven't we brought in marketing teams to fix this? Michael asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Let them come up with an interesting concept. Pitch us some ideas. There's no budget for that, George interrupted. And even if we could rebrand the place, it won't change the fact that the location isn't ideal. We should focus on the places that are actually bringing in revenue. Fine, Michael sighed. We'll close it, sell the property, and use the money to boost marketing for the remaining locations. As he spoke the words, Michael felt a pang of regret. He had opened that restaurant himself, cut the ribbon at the grand opening. It had been his pride and joy, the very first of his ventures on this street. He remembered how his family had gathered to congratulate him, how food critics and food lovers had once filled the room. Now, the thought of selling it felt like a personal failure. He had poured so much of himself into it, designing the interior, selecting the furniture, hiring the staff. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was his creation. As they walked into the empty dining area, two waitresses were chatting idly by the bar, while the bartender demonstrated a drink trick. The sight of them slacking off when the restaurant was in crisis infuriated Michael. "What the hell is going on here?" he snapped, his voice harsh like a scolding parent who had caught their children misbehaving. The staff froze, staring at their boss in terror. "This is how you work? No wonder I have to shut this place down." Michael shouted. "Sir, no one comes here," one of the bolder waitresses muttered, avoiding eye contact. "And whose fault is that?" Michael shot back. "Yours for not trying to bring in customers?" She lowered her eyes, knowing that any further words might get her fired on the spot. But the truth was clear to everyone in the room. The restaurant had failed, not because the staff wasn't trying, but because the concept hadn't worked from the start. "Gather everyone," Michael told Jessica. "I have an announcement." Within minutes, the small remaining staff of 10 or so people gathered in the dining area. The sight of so few employees shocked Michael. When they'd opened, there had been at least 30. "Is this all of you?" Michael asked, incredulous. "Yes, sir," Jessica replied quietly. The others resigned. They weren't happy with the pay. "All right," Michael sighed, collecting himself. "I have some unfortunate news. I've made the decision to close this restaurant." There was a murmur of disappointment among the staff. Michael cleared his throat, and silence fell again. He hated this. Hated how painful it was to deliver this news. His throat felt dry, and he had to force the words out. "I'll pay all of you 3 months' salary in advance, so you'll have time to find new jobs," he said finally. "Thank you for your work." As soon as the words were out, Michael felt a tightness in his chest, a weight he hadn't anticipated. He was shutting down the first restaurant he had ever opened, a place that had once symbolized his success. Now, it was a symbol of his failure. His voice had grown raspy, and his lips were dry, as if he hadn't had water in days. The staff, visibly saddened, dispersed to gather their belongings. It was the right decision, Michael told himself, but it didn't make it any easier. After 15 minutes, only Michael, George, and Jessica remained in the restaurant. "I need to inspect the kitchen," Michael said after a moment, needing a distraction from the weight of the closure. They walked through the restaurant, checking the kitchen equipment and inventory, assessing the value of what could be sold or rented out along with the property. The kitchen was large, designed to accommodate at least 6 chefs, but there were only 3 left, and they barely had enough work to keep them busy. As they moved toward the back of the restaurant, Michael saw a figure near the back door, a woman, huddled under a makeshift blanket, holding a small child in her arms. "We're closed," Jessica called out, but the woman didn't move. Michael frowned, walking closer. The woman appeared to be homeless, her clothes tattered, her hair unkempt. And in her arms was an infant, crying softly. Michael crouched down to get a better look at the woman and the child. He felt a surge of discomfort as he took in the scene, a mother, barely able to take care of herself, let alone a baby. His first instinct was frustration. This was his property, and they had no business being there. "Who are you?" he asked firmly, but not without some compassion. The woman remained silent, her eyes wide with fear, holding the child close to her chest. The baby continued to cry softly. "Jessica," Michael called over his shoulder. "Get George. I want this taken care of." Jessica nodded and hurried off. Michael turned back to the woman. "I want to help you," he said, softening his tone. "But you can't stay here. What's your name?" The woman hesitated before muttering quietly, "Fatima." "And the baby?" Michael asked, glancing at the small, crying bundle in her arms. "Her name is Amara," Fatima said, her voice trembling. Before Michael could respond, George appeared behind him, clipboard still in hand, his expression irritated. "What's going on?" George asked brusquely. Michael stood up and faced his manager. "She needs help, George. Get someone from the hospital to take care of them. They can't stay here." George raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "This isn't a shelter, Michael. If we help one, soon there'll be more." Michael shot him a look. "I'm not asking for a debate. Just make the call. They need to be taken to the hospital. Now." George let out a sigh, pulling out his phone to make the arrangements. As he stepped away to speak with someone from the hospital, Michael turned back to Fatima. "We're going to get you and your baby somewhere safe," he told her. "You'll be taken care of." Fatima looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes, but she said nothing. Michael could see the exhaustion on her face, the strain of trying to survive. "I'll make sure of it," he added gently, standing up straight again as George returned. "They'll be here in 20 minutes, George said flatly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I'll handle it from here." "Good," Michael nodded. See that they're taken care of properly. As he turned to leave, Fatima's voice stopped him. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael paused, glancing back at her one last time. He gave a brief nod before walking away, a weight in his chest that he hadn't expected. He wasn't sure why this woman and her child had affected him so much, but something about the situation stayed with him. Later that night, back at home, Michael sat with his wife, Evelyn, in their spacious living room. A warm fire crackled in the fireplace, and the soft glow illuminated the room. Evelyn sipped her tea, her eyes watching her husband closely. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his brow furrowed as he stared into the fire. You're quiet tonight, she said gently, placing her cup down on the table. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's just been a long day, he replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Did something happen at the restaurant? She asked, concern creeping into her voice. Michael leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment before speaking. We're shutting it down. The numbers are bad, and it's just not sustainable anymore. Evelyn nodded slowly, though she could see there was more on his mind. And? Michael opened his eyes, meeting hers. There was a woman, outside the restaurant. Homeless, with a baby. I had to send them to the hospital. I couldn't just leave them there, you know? Evelyn's expression softened. Of course. You did the right thing. Did I? Michael asked, frustration leaking into his voice. It feels like I'm doing everything wrong lately. The business is failing, I'm laying people off, and now I'm dealing with homeless mothers on top of everything. Evelyn stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Michael, you've always been a good man. You care about people. That's why you sent them to the hospital. You're not failing. You're just facing challenges, like any business owner does. Michael looked up at her, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. I just don't know what to do anymore, Eve. Everything feels like it's falling apart. Evelyn leaned down and kissed the top of his head. One step at a time. You'll figure it out. And you've got me to help you through it. Michael smiled weakly. I don't deserve you. Evelyn laughed softly. You're probably right. But you've got me anyway. The next day, Michael couldn't stop thinking about Fatima and her baby. After making a few calls to the hospital to check on them, he learned that they were stable and in good hands. But something kept nagging at him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he should do more. By the afternoon, he made a decision. He drove to the hospital, carrying a bouquet of flowers he had hastily picked up from a local florist. When he arrived at the room where Fatima and her baby were staying, he knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. Fatima was sitting up in bed, holding Amara, who was quietly sleeping in her arms. She looked up in surprise when she saw Michael standing there with the flowers. I didn't know what kind of flowers you'd like, Michael said awkwardly, setting the bouquet on the small table by her bed. I just picked what the florist recommended. Fatima smiled softly, though her eyes still held traces of weariness. Thank you. They're beautiful. Michael sat down in the chair beside her bed. How are you feeling? He asked, genuinely concerned. Fatima nodded. Better. The doctors have been kind. And Amara? She's healthy, Fatima replied, glancing down at the sleeping child. I'm just so grateful for your help. I don't know how to repay you. Michael waved a hand dismissively. Don't worry about that. I'm just glad you're both okay. There was a moment of silence before Michael spoke again, this time more hesitantly. Do you have anywhere to go when they discharge you? Family? Friends? Fatima shook her head slowly. No. We don't have anyone. It's just the two of us. Michael exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, if you don't have anywhere else, I can offer you a place to stay. Just for a few days, until we figure something out. Fatima's eyes widened in surprise. I can't accept that. You've already done so much. Michael held up a hand. Look, it's a big house. Plenty of room. My wife and I, we're in a position to help, and I don't see why we shouldn't. It's just for a little while. You can think about it. Fatima hesitated, glancing down at Amara. I don't know. At least consider it, Michael said gently. You don't have to decide right now. Fatima looked up at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. Okay. I'll think about it. Michael nodded, standing up to leave. Take your time. I'll check back in with you tomorrow. As he left the hospital, Michael couldn't help but feel like he was getting himself into something far more complicated than he had bargained for. But deep down, he knew it was the right thing to do. The next day, Michael returned to the hospital. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with questions about what he had gotten himself into. Offering a stranger shelter, even temporarily, was far from what he was used to. His wife Evelyn had been surprisingly supportive, though he could tell she had her own reservations. When he arrived at Fatima's room, she was awake, gently rocking Amara in her arms. The sight of the small, peaceful child nestled against her mother gave Michael a pang of unexpected emotion. He knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Good morning," he greeted with a soft smile. Fatima looked up, surprised to see him again so soon. "Good morning," she responded quietly, her voice still laced with uncertainty. Michael took a few steps into the room, stopping at the foot of the bed. "I just wanted to check in on you. How are you feeling today?" Fatima glanced down at her baby, her fingers brushing Amara's cheek lightly. "We're doing better, thanks to you." Michael cleared his throat, trying to find the right words for what he was about to suggest. "Listen, I know this is probably overwhelming, and you don't know me or my wife, but we've talked it over, and our offer still stands. You can come stay with us, just for a few days. Get back on your feet." Fatima hesitated, her brow furrowing as she processed his words. "I don't know if that's the right thing to do. I've never relied on anyone before. It feels strange." Michael nodded, understanding her apprehension. "I get it. I'm not trying to pressure you. But think of it as a temporary solution. You've got Amara to think about. This way, you don't have to worry about where you're going next." Fatima looked down at her baby, the weight of responsibility evident in her eyes. After a few moments, she finally spoke. "Okay. Just for a few days." Relief washed over Michael. "Great. I'll arrange everything, and we'll get you out of here by this evening." Later that day, Michael and Evelyn prepared their guest room. Evelyn, ever the perfectionist, fussed over every little detail, ensuring the bed was made with fresh linens and that everything was spotless. Michael could tell she was nervous, though she tried to hide it. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked, smoothing out the last wrinkle in the blanket. Michael paused, watching her closely. "I think so. It's just for a little while, Eve. We'll help her out, and she'll move on." Evelyn nodded, biting her lip. "I hope so. I just don't want things to get complicated." Michael walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "It'll be fine. We'll manage." That evening, Michael drove Fatima and Amara to their home. Fatima seemed overwhelmed as they pulled up to the house, her eyes wide as she took in the large, well-maintained property. Michael couldn't blame her. It was a lot for anyone to take in, especially someone who had been living on the streets. This is your house?" Fatima asked quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yeah," Michael said, feeling a little self-conscious. "It's home." He helped her out of the car and carried a few of her belongings inside while Evelyn greeted them at the door, smiling warmly but with a hint of awkwardness. "Welcome," Evelyn said, stepping aside to let them in. "I've set up the guest room for you. Please make yourself comfortable." Fatima smiled, though it was clear she felt out of place. "Thank you. I don't know how to express my gratitude." Evelyn waved a hand. "Don't worry about it. We're just glad we can help." As the evening went on, they settled into a quiet, polite routine. Fatima stayed mostly in her room, tending to Amara, while Michael and Evelyn tried to give her space. But over the next few days, as they got to know Fatima a little better, the initial awkwardness began to ease. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Fatima shared a little more about her past. "I wasn't always like this," she said, her voice soft. "Before everything went wrong, I had a job, a place of my own. But when Amara came, things fell apart." Michael and Evelyn listened quietly, not pressing her for details but offering support in their own way. "It's been hard," Fatima continued. "But Amara is all I have now. I just want to give her a better life." "You will," Evelyn said gently. "You're doing your best, and that's all that matters." Fatima smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope so." The days turned into a week, and Michael could tell that Fatima was growing more comfortable. She even offered to help around the house, cooking meals or cleaning up after dinner. But despite her growing ease, Michael knew they couldn't offer her a permanent solution. They needed to help her find something more stable. One morning, Michael approached Fatima in the kitchen, where she was preparing breakfast. "Hey, I've been thinking," he began, leaning against the counter. "I know you've been through a lot, but I have a proposition for you." Fatima looked up, curious but cautious. "What is it?" Michael hesitated for a moment before continuing. "The cafe we own, the one we're not planning to close down, they need help. It's not glamorous work, but it's a job. And it's something you could do while figuring out your next steps." Fatima's eyes widened in surprise. "You're offering me a job?" Michael nodded. "If you want it. It's up to you." Tears welled up in Fatima's eyes as she processed the offer. I don't know what to say." "Yes, of course. Thank you." Michael smiled. "Great. I'll introduce you to the team tomorrow. You'll fit right in." As the days passed, Fatima quickly adapted to her new role at the cafe. She was diligent, hardworking, and eager to prove herself. The cafe staff welcomed her with open arms, and it wasn't long before Fatima became an integral part of the team. At night, when she returned to Michael and Evelyn's house, she would sit with them and share stories of her day. For the first time in a long while, she seemed genuinely happy. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Michael turned to Fatima. "You know, you've really turned things around." Fatima smiled, her eyes soft with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without both of you." Evelyn reached over and squeezed her hand. "We're just glad you're here. And Amara too." Fatima's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. "I'll never forget what you've done for us." And for the first time in months, Michael felt like he had truly done something right. The next morning, Michael woke up with a lingering sense of unease, but also a strange determination. He had made up his mind to help Fatima and Amara. After a quick breakfast, he told Evelyn about his decision to offer them a temporary stay at their home. Evelyn looked up from her coffee, her expression unreadable. "You want to bring them here? Into our home?" Michael nodded, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Just for a few days, maybe a week, until she figures out her next move." Evelyn sipped her coffee slowly, her eyes locked on her husband. "Are you sure about this, Michael? We don't know anything about her." Michael sighed. "I know, but that's why I want to help. She's got no one. And they're not safe on the streets." Evelyn set her cup down and stood up, walking over to him. "I get that you want to help. But what if this turns into something bigger? What if it's not just a few days?" "We'll figure it out," Michael replied, though even he wasn't sure how they would. Evelyn looked up at him, her expression softening. "All right," she said finally. "But let's be cautious. I don't want to regret this." Michael smiled gratefully, pulling her into a hug. "Thank you, Eve. I'll make sure this doesn't become a problem." Later that afternoon, Michael returned to the hospital. Fatima was feeding Amara when he arrived, and she looked up in surprise as he entered the room. "I wasn't expecting you so soon," she said, gently rocking the baby in her arms. Michael shrugged. "I wanted to check on you. Have you thought any more about what I offered?" Fatima hesitated, glancing down at Amara. I have. And I want to say yes. But I'm still not sure if it's the right thing to do." Michael stepped closer, pulling up a chair. "It's a safe place, Fatima. You won't be a burden. My wife and we've talked about it, and we really want to help." Fatima looked into his eyes, her expression full of uncertainty. But after a moment, she nodded. "Okay. I'll come. Just for a little while." Michael smiled, relief washing over him. "Good. I'll have my driver pick you up when you're discharged. We'll get you settled in." 2 days later, Fatima and Amara arrived at Michael and Evelyn's home. It was a sprawling estate, with a large garden and plenty of space. Evelyn greeted them at the door with a warm but cautious smile, showing them to the guest room where they would stay. Fatima couldn't help but feel out of place in such a luxurious home. She had spent so long struggling, living on the streets, that it almost felt surreal to be surrounded by comfort and warmth. But she was grateful, deeply so. Evelyn watched her quietly, noticing how Fatima moved around the house with quiet apprehension, as if she was afraid to touch anything. "You don't have to be nervous," Evelyn said gently one evening as they sat in the living room. "This is your home for now. Make yourself comfortable." Fatima smiled weakly, nodding. "I'm just not used to any of this." Evelyn nodded in understanding. "It'll take time. But you'll get there." As the days passed, Michael found himself growing more invested in Fatima's future. He began making calls, speaking with his connections in the restaurant industry, trying to find her work. He knew she couldn't stay forever, and she needed a stable job to get back on her feet. One evening, after a long day at the restaurant, Michael sat down with Fatima in the living room. Amara was asleep in her crib, and the house was quiet. "I've been thinking," Michael said, leaning forward slightly. "There's an opening at the cafe across the street from the restaurant. They need someone in the kitchen. It's nothing fancy, but it's a start. What do you think?" Fatima's eyes widened. "You mean, a job?" Michael nodded. "Yes. It's not much, but it's work. You'll be able to support yourself and Amara. And maybe, down the line, you'll find something better." Fatima blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the offer. "I don't know what to say. Thank you, Michael. This means everything to me." "Don't thank me yet," Michael said with a smile. "Just make sure you give it your best shot." The following week, Fatima started working at the cafe. At first, she was nervous, unsure of herself in a professional kitchen. But as the days went by, she found her rhythm. Her pastries, especially her cinnamon rolls, quickly became a customer favorite. The cafe's sales began to pick up, and word spread about the new baker in town. Michael visited the cafe frequently, checking in on Fatima's progress. Each time he went, he was amazed by the growing popularity of her creations. One day, the cafe owner pulled him aside. "You've got yourself a real gem there," the owner said, grinning. "Her cinnamon rolls are flying off the shelves. She's really turning this place around." Michael smiled proudly. I knew she had it in her. By the end of the month, Fatima had settled into her new life. She had a stable job, a safe place to stay, and Amara was thriving. But despite all of this, she still felt a lingering sense of uncertainty about the future. One evening, as she and Michael sat in the garden, watching the sunset, Fatima finally voiced the question that had been on her mind. "What's going to happen when my time here is up?" she asked quietly. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." Michael glanced at her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're not overstaying anything. But I've been thinking about that too. You're doing great at the cafe, and people love your food. I think it's time we talk about the next step." Fatima looked at him, confused. "Next step?" Michael nodded. "I've got an idea. How would you feel about running your own place? A small bakery, maybe. You've got the talent, and with a little help, you could make it happen." Fatima's jaw dropped. "My own place? Michael, I don't even know where to start." Michael smiled. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll help you with the business side of things. We can start small, see how it goes. You've already proven you can run a kitchen. Now it's just about taking that next leap." Fatima stared at him, her heart racing. She had never imagined something like this was even possible. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Michael said with a grin. "And let's get started." Fatima took a deep breath, her mind spinning with possibilities. After a long pause, she nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes. Let's do it." And so, the journey began. With Michael's help, Fatima opened her own small bakery just down the street from the cafe. It was modest at first, but her pastries quickly gained a loyal following, and soon, the bakery became a local favorite. Months passed, and Fatima's life transformed in ways she had never imagined. She went from struggling on the streets to running a successful business, all thanks to the kindness of a stranger who had become her friend. As the bakery flourished, Michael and Evelyn continued to support her, watching with pride as Fatima built a new life for herself and Amara. And through it all, they remained close, becoming like family. For Fatima, it was more than just a second chance. It was a new beginning. And for Michael, it was a reminder that sometimes, the greatest rewards come from helping those who need it most. As the bakery's success continued to grow, Fatima became more confident in her abilities, not just as a baker but as a business owner. She learned quickly how to manage the daily operations, from ordering supplies to managing her small but dedicated team. Her reputation in the neighborhood soared, with locals often recommending her pastries to friends and visitors alike. Michael was always around for support, though he made sure not to interfere too much. He wanted Fatima to run the business her way, allowing her to carve out her own path. However, every now and then, he'd stop by the bakery for a coffee and one of her famous cinnamon rolls. One afternoon, as Fatima was preparing for the evening rush, Michael walked in with a thoughtful expression. He sat down at the counter, watching her work. "You've really made something incredible here, Fatima," he said, admiring how effortlessly she moved around the kitchen. Fatima wiped her hands on her apron and smiled, coming over to the counter to pour him a cup of coffee. "I couldn't have done it without you, Michael." Michael waved a hand. "You give me too much credit? This was all you." They shared a quiet moment, the smell of freshly baked pastries filling the air. As they sat together, the front door jingled, and a familiar face walked in, Evelyn. "Well, look who finally made it out of the house," Michael teased as Evelyn approached, planting a kiss on his cheek. "I couldn't resist the smell," Evelyn replied, her eyes twinkling as she looked around the bustling bakery. "It's amazing what you've done with the place, Fatima." Fatima blushed. "Thank you, Evelyn. It's been a whirlwind, but I'm happy." Evelyn took a seat beside Michael, glancing over the menu. "I'm so glad you found your footing. And now, you're part of the neighborhood. Everyone's talking about your pastries." Fatima smiled gratefully, though she still couldn't fully wrap her mind around how far she had come. It wasn't that long ago that she was struggling to find food for herself and Amara, and now she was running a successful bakery. As the afternoon continued, more customers flowed in and out of the bakery, many of them regulars who had become friends with Fatima. The warm, inviting atmosphere she had created was something special, and it wasn't just about the pastries. People came for the experience, the connection, and the kindness that Fatima embodied. Later that evening, after closing up shop, Fatima sat in the quiet of the bakery, reflecting on everything. She had a small notebook where she wrote down ideas for new recipes, business strategies, and personal thoughts. She opened it and began jotting down notes for a new seasonal menu. But her thoughts drifted back to her past, the hard times, the uncertainty, and the kindness she had found in Michael and Evelyn. She had never asked for help, but it came to her when she needed it the most. Now, she was determined to pay it forward. A few days later, Fatima approached Michael with an idea. She found him in the cafe, chatting with some of the staff. "Michael, can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. Michael glanced up, noticing the energy in her expression. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Fatima sat down across from him, her hands clasped together. "I've been thinking a lot about how far I've come, and how none of this would have been possible without your help." Michael tilted his head, smiling. "You've earned everything you have, Fatima. You don't owe me anything." "I know, but I want to do something to give back," Fatima said earnestly. "There are so many people like me out there, people who need a second chance but don't know where to start. I was thinking, maybe we could start a program, something that gives people the opportunity to work, to learn, and to rebuild their lives." Michael leaned back in his chair, clearly intrigued. "You're talking about something like a community outreach program?" "Exactly," Fatima said, her eyes shining. "We could offer internships or apprenticeships in the bakery, maybe even in the restaurant. We could partner with local shelters and organizations to find people who need a fresh start. I want to help others the way you helped me." Michael thought for a moment, his admiration for Fatima growing with each passing second. "That's a brilliant idea, Fatima. I think we could make that happen." Excitement bubbled up inside her. "Really? You think it could work?" Michael nodded. "Absolutely. We'll need to do some planning and make sure we have the right structure in place, but I don't see why we can't get started soon. I'll talk to some people I know, and we'll figure out the details." Fatima beamed. "Thank you, Michael. This means so much to me." A few weeks later, the new program was officially launched. They called it New Beginnings, a fitting name for the initiative that would provide work opportunities and mentorship to those in need. Fatima's Bakery became the heart of the program, offering training in baking and customer service, while Michael's restaurant provided opportunities in culinary arts and hospitality. The program quickly gained attention from the local community, and soon, other businesses were eager to join in. With Michael and Fatima leading the charge, New Beginnings expanded, helping dozens of people get back on their feet. Fatima's Bakery became not only a place of business but a symbol of hope and transformation. Every time she looked around at her bustling kitchen, filled with people eager to learn and grow, she was reminded of how far she had come, and how much further she could go. As the years went by, Fatima's Bakery became a staple of the community, a place where everyone felt welcome, no matter their background. And while her journey had started with uncertainty, it had led her to a life filled with purpose, gratitude, and success. Fatima never forgot the kindness that had changed her life. And through New Beginnings, she made sure that others, too, would have a chance to rewrite their own stories, just as she had rewritten hers. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Subscribe to the channel Tell Me and share this video with your friends and loved ones. This motivates us to continue working on new stories every day. Do not miss the next amazing story that is about to appear on your screen. We are very grateful to you for being with us. In the description under this video you can open the catalog of all the stories. See you there.